Hello, everybody. Let's see if I can get this thing working. There we go. Looking forward to today's talk. We're going to talk a bit about, let's just say, some contrarian viewpoints that I have on the industry from a facilities perspective. Give you some insight into some of the holistic thinking of the way that I look at things, and maybe give you a couple things to think about and take away as you look at different scenarios in your world on data centers. So let's get in the mood for it. Those of you that follow my blog know I'm a little bit on the pop culture side of things. So there's a couple myths out there. One of them was, for those of you that can remember Captain Kangaroo, Mr. Green Jeans was supposedly, Frank Zappa was his son. That was one of the myths that at least I grew up with during the day. Another one was, if you throw the rice at the pigeons during the wedding, that the pigeons fly off and then they explode. But as Mark Twain says, never let the facts get in the way of a good story, and that's what we're going to address today. Number one myth in the space has been going on for a very long time, watts per square foot. High density watts per square foot is what you need. The problem with that myth is that it doesn't matter. What you actually need to be concentrating on is what you can cool per rack. Who cares what the square footage is? It's a moot argument. You don't need to worry about the square footage, because as a matter of fact, one of the worst sins that you can do in the data center space is to run out of space and not power. So if you're very focused that every rack that you have is going to be at 12 kilowatts, then the software that actually runs on them actually gets it to about 4 kilowatts. And you've tightly packed that into an environment that only supports 12 kilowatt racks. Guess what? You run out of space and not power. And I know many of you have encountered projects like that. So the focus from an engineering perspective never should have been taking the total square footage and dividing it by the square feet, or taking the total square footage, dividing it by the watts. It should have been, how can I direct my cooling capacity on a per rack basis? Number one myth. Second one I talked about last year, and it's on more efficient PUE, and there's a more detailed case study on this, but the concept is lower PUE is better. The amount of times that people are focused on dropping PUE from 1.5 to 1.4 or 1.3 to 1.2, many times it's not a holistic argument. In this case, we do some math on adding an adiabatic cooler to get free cooling in a climate like New Mexico, which is supposedly a perfect climate for that. The problem is when you incorporate the water element, the cost of the adiabatic cooler, it's a negative payback on a 10-year basis versus just going ahead and having the compressors turn off. So free, what's intuitive, is not necessarily true from a holistic basis. So free is in the eye of the beholder. And oftentimes when you incorporate all the different economic elements, you can find out that free really isn't so free. Myth number 3, less space is cheaper. There's a concept that smaller data centers are less expensive. Emerson put out a forward-looking survey for everybody, and it said that there's going to be 52 kilowatt racks in the future, and data centers are going to be tiny. The issue is that in reality, there's kind of a Goldilocks zone. There's a zone out there when you're talking about cooling where once you pass that zone, the cost to cool it it's too much versus just getting a bit more space. Now, obviously, there are scenarios when you need to be space constrained. Maybe it's in downtown, Manhattan, as a for example, or maybe it's in maybe it's a scenario where you absolutely can't get any more land from your company, and there are exceptions to that. However, reality is that you have to stay in that Goldilocks zone, and there's a zone out there that once you're past that zone, you're much better off just taking more space. And I think you've seen that with, say, some of the large scale out internets, where their viewpoint has spread out as opposed to gone smaller. They've gone to cheaper spots for land as opposed to continuing to go to kilowatt densities that create all kinds of other issues. I know Don Beatty's talked about in the past, some of the OSHA issues you run into if you're in a 150-degree hot aisle and the sound that's going on in those types of environments and things along those lines. But less space basically is cheaper is a myth. There is a point where that's true, but you've got to factor in the cost to cool that small space versus the cost to just expand a bit more. Now, the one I really want to spend a lot of time on today is going to surprise most of you, and that is that scale drives out cost. I mean, right? We all know that, or at least we're taught that. I mean, the lesson in economics is that, look, if I can build up my scale, I can reduce my cost per whatever it is. My cost per number is going to go down. There's 3 models that we're going to talk about today, and yes, I am naming some names, and we're going to go through those models. The 3 most common models that I'll put up are 3 outsourcing models: the DuPont-Fabros, which is an all-at-once methodology, the Digital Realty pod-by-pod methodology, and then the modular methodology adopted by I/O. Yes, there are other companies, there are other examples, but those are the 3 that I chose to highlight today. So the first glance of the DuPont model. So DuPont builds very, very large facilities. They are these mega structures, 400,000 plus square foot facilities. All the shell and core is built out day one. They have a shared backplane, meaning engines and cooling infrastructure, things along those lines. Their latest build, all of this information is from either SEC filings or investor presentations, all publicly available information for you to go back and check my math and things. But their ACC7, which is in Northern Virginia, is their latest generation build. The first phase of it has just under 12 meg of IT load to the computer. There's 28 data halls at the endpoint and a almost 42 megawatt facility at the end of the day of IT load. That's a massive, massive facility. They have N+2 redundancy, and the first phase has 8 data halls at just under 1.5 meg each. So the reported costs are just under $8,000 per kilowatt for this data center. The digital model, a large structure, not a massive structure like a DuPont model. They've built out the shell and core day one. They then have these dedicated pods. So unlike the previous model, these are everything is independent infrastructure for each and every pod. Their Dallas project that they disclosed in some of their investor day presentations was the low end of the cost range, and it had 6 of these 1,125 kilowatt pods. The redundancy is 2N on the electrical and N+1 on the mechanical. Their reported costs, excluding land, was just under $10,000 per kW. The I/O model is, once again, a massive structure, large structure. Build out the shell and core day one. It's modular at an even more granular level. So I think it's in a couple 100 kilowatt increments that they can deal with. They also have a shared backplane methodology for heat rejection generator. There's a lot more configurable options, but chilled water is their base level configuration. It requires a raised floor environment to go into. And the reported costs, we're guessing, are somewhere around the DuPont or the digital types of numbers. But as at least their S1 filing was not public information yet. It was filed privately, so I'm kind of guessing on the reported costs. So let's take a deeper look at these models. On the big one, you build out the massive facility, the DuPont model. $95 million was allocated to the first phase. There's this concept of redevelopment space, and that's a bucket that's held for non-sellable inventory. There's another $72.8 million that's allocated to redevelopment space. So real day one costs for that model are $167 million. Day one cost. So how much is the real cost per kilowatt day one? And what you look at is really big numbers. If I take my if I allocate all the cost of the future space as well as the first phase, I'm looking at $112,000 a kilowatt for the first pod, for the first 1.5 meg. If I tell myself that that future phase didn't really count, then I'm still at $64,000 a kilowatt. Let's look at another one, digital model, deeper look. So 18 million spent day one for what they call a PBB plus. That's the building and conference rooms and all that sort of good stuff, excluding the land. By the way, DuPont's numbers were all inclusive. So, and then 8.23 million per pod with a real day one. So real day one costs 26 million. So if I build that building and I put one pod in it, and then I have 5 vacant areas where I could build future pods, my first pod cost is actually $23,000 a kilowatt. And I do get to those numbers. I get down to that 9,000 number on my by the time I get to my 6th pod. And for I/O, I don't have a rabbit, so there's no rabbit in my hat. But there are elements of both the digital model and the DuPont model, and the fundamental thing is you're definitely building out a building on the front end to house this stuff. So it's got shared backplane elements, and it's probably somewhere in similar range depending upon how big that building is day one of that particular model. So question, why is this important? In this graph here, we see our reported dollar per kW on the left, and we see our actual dollar per kW on the right. So what is the reported kW? Well, the reported is to say I'm only taking in the case of digital, I'm taking 1/6 of the base building and allocating it to each and every pod going forward. So therefore, I get to my, just the yellow line there that's just around 10,000 a kilowatt. And then in DuPont's case, they're taking whatever it is, there's 20, however many data halls. So that portion, I take all the base building, I only allocate a 24th of that or a 21st of that to each and every pod. The issue is as you can see on the right, is that it actually takes you all 6 pods in the case of digital to get to the reported dollar per kilowatt, and it takes you more than 8 pods leased to get you to the dollar per kilowatt for DuPont. So what's the actual cost of scale? In the case of DuPont, it's $170 million. In the case of digital, it's right around $70 million. So, okay, I can get to my numbers per whatever using scale. But what does that mean? What does it mean for a service provider? I'll take a wholesale example here. So a scale model, using scale, leveraging scale, takes me $70 million to get to my true return on cost. So a wholesale provider, as a for example, is going to take all the costs of it, that's going to be the denominator, and then the net income that they derive from rent after all the expenses is on the numerator. That's how you get to a return on cost. So using a digital scenario, using a aggressive rent rate of $100 per kilowatt per month net, if I use that as my model, 12% is the general target, and you hit that number when you hit 6 pods. So you get to 12%. But what happens if it's only 2? What happens if it takes 10 years to lease up? What is the true return on cost at that point in time? So what does that mean for an enterprise? Well, no C-suite likes white elephants, but we all know of some of those that are out there. So a scale model is going to require a minimum investment of, let's take digital, one of the lowest cost operators in the space, $70 million plus. So the issue is if you're not using 5 meg very quickly, it's a really, really bad approach. You can't get there on the math. If you NPV it, it's not, you're going to be spending $55 million. Take that $70 million, you build that out, you NPV that, it's 7.5%, assuming you do 1 pod per year. Now, how many of us in this room have hit our projected IT load growth? Is anybody going to raise their hand? I don't think I see anybody. So what happens if you don't use that future capacity? Your project that you've based it on this concept of scale doesn't work. So what am I not saying? Am I saying scale's bad? No, I'm not. I'm saying that there's a fundamental assumption that is not included when people talk about scale. And that fundamental assumption is you use the scale day one. The reason why Google and Facebook can do what they do is they move in 10 mega load right away. It takes them a few weeks to ramp up all that capacity. When you take that same philosophy and you apply it to your 10-year enterprise plan that's going to grow over time, and you use that same philosophy to get to that cost per widget, cost per KW, cost per square foot on a scale basis, you're dealing with 2 different problems. Because your ramp-ups may be 2 meg day 1, and maybe by year 3 we get another meg, and maybe by year 7 we have another meg. And by the way, Michelle just talked about, well, what's it going to be in from a hybrid cloud perspective, public cloud perspective, never mind M&A activity, because that of course never impacts anything. You start questioning things. Is scale bad? No, scale is wonderful when you use it. So do I believe that DuPont and Digital and IO have bad business models? Absolutely not. I don't. I mean, when you look at the markets that they serve, these are markets where demand clearly outstrips supply. They continually are filling up these facilities. However, as our market matures, you're a new entrant in the service provider space. Can you handle the carry time? Can your balance sheet handle years worth of lease up? And that's a question. So there's a lot of facilities where scale is out there. There's few facilities where scale is used. You take Switch in Las Vegas. It's used. Good application. Ramping up very quickly. If you're matching the load appropriately from a service provider perspective, it's a wonderful philosophy. And it really does drive out overall cost. The challenge is, what do you do when you don't have the scale usage in a very short period of time? So, I mean, what am I looking for you to take away from this? And by the way, I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So, but what I'm looking for is that economics, in and of themselves, are very simple. And as a recovering engineer like I am, economics, though, don't always tell the whole story, and they can be awful for your business decisions when you're not viewing them holistically. So on any of those myths, if you're looking at it with the wrong assumption set, it doesn't matter what your math is. And what you're doing in your environment, my PUE is better. Well, how? I mean, technical efficiency is only one part of it. Economic efficiency is critical to the success of the service provider industry, right? They live and die by it. But it's also critical to the success of the business side of IT, which is driving commercials today. So when folks are looking at build versus buy, the most important question you can ask is, do you have the same assumption set? If you're going to use scale, are you absolutely sure that you're going to use up that space, that KW capacity, in a short time frame? Because if you're not, I posit to you, you shouldn't be applying those principles. Do the math yourself. It doesn't work. You can use this for any part of the IT stack. One of my favorite ones is I talked to an enterprise once, and they were talking about open compute and how they wanted to use open compute. Well, Facebook did a wonderful socially benevolent thing with open compute, right? It was for social benevolence. I'm sure that's the reason why they shared it with everyone. Or maybe it was because they didn't quite have the buying power that Microsoft and Google did, and they wanted to figure out a way to drive down costs. When you look at something like that, which, by the way, I think that's a brilliant idea. And then I sat in this enterprise office, and they said, yeah, we really love the servers. And we want to get that benefit of that extra cooling basis because the servers don't have covers on them. The reason why the servers don't have covers on them has to do with technicians not needing to remove covers to replace components. It has nothing to do with cooling. What Facebook was trying to solve was the amount of time per tech that the tech had to spend to fix something. But what we do many times as an industry, either by sleight of hand or by just not understanding something, is we misinterpret how these elements are used in other parts of the IT stack. So when you look at what works for industry, make sure you're working off of the same assumption that the industry has. Because if you don't, you're solving the wrong problem. I mean, that's like, on my lawn at my house, I could solve that the same way, that Fenway Park is mowed. It's not a very efficient way for me to solve that. And yet so many of us, myself included in my past, by the way, this isn't because I'm smart, this is, wisdom comes from scars, right? Screwing stuff up. So many of us don't look and make sure that the question set is the same. And it is amazing how successful you will be with your C-suite, with your management sector, if you can describe things with the same assumption sets. When your CEO is coming to you, CFO, saying, why aren't we all on the cloud? Right? Cloud, cloud, cloud. They've heard it 50 times. It's a much better argument to talk to them. How come we're not doing our data centers in the middle of Iowa? Well, the issues are nothing to do with IT. They have to do with your assumption set. Actually, our workload is this small. Our HR policy doesn't take very kindly to paying the chief engineer $350,000 a year to live in the middle of a field. There's a lot of factors that have nothing to do with whether it's cloud or not. And so you've got to work on your assumption sets. And I will encourage each of you to step back. And anybody that's got a panacea, anybody that's sitting there and says, this is the next greatest thing, and it's going to take over the world. I guarantee you in every one of those cases, if you peel it back, you step back, you look at it and you go, what problem are they trying to solve? You'll get a much better analysis of what it is whether or not it applies to you. Are there things that we can learn from these other groups? Absolutely. But there are things that you can learn that you can potentially apply. But the worst mistake that you can make, the most money you can waste, the biggest white elephant projects that are out there, and nobody likes having those albatrosses hung around their neck. You can solve those if you just don't get wrapped up in what's cool or what other guys are doing or, wow, look at their cost per this. Because if it's not the same assumption set, it's a worthless argument. So I guess don't believe everything you hear, including this talk. Consensus, whenever 97% of anybody agree on something, probably a good chance that somebody else the other 3% is making pretty good money. When it comes to economics, looks can be deceiving. Stranded capacity. How many people have had that before? Had that. Lower PUE that actually costs more. Had that. Less space. Cost me more money. Had that. And I think your economics textbook does not do a good job of giving you the assumption sets of when principles apply. I don't care whether it's Keynesian economics versus the principle of scale. You have to understand the assumption set. There is a better way for those of you that don't have scale, but I've come to my to time to take some Q&A. So I'd encourage any of you to talk to us about some of the ways that we've tried to solve that. But I guess at this point, I thought I'd leave plenty of time for questions because I put up a lot of numbers. I'm sure there's plenty of interesting opinions on some of the things we've talked about today. Or not.
Thank you for the talk. I'm Mohammed Abusa from H.H. Angus in Canada. I would like, just if I take 30 seconds to share something, what you said now is a flashback to me. Back in 2004, between 2004 and 2007, we were building mega cooling plants in Dubai, following the great build out and so on. The same story, the same thing that you were saying. People were running, private companies, investors, to build centralized utility plants. Assumptions. Going with the assumption, build it, people will come. Forget the financial downturn. It was mega, people were competing. Like, I'm assuming today people are competing to build colo locations. You see new companies coming out from here and there. The assumptions killed the majority. The only people who survive today are deep pockets, governments who own the utility plants, and everyone else sold and went bankrupt. So I understand what you're saying. I appreciate what you just said, is that take care of the assumptions, be honest, be transparent with your investors, with yourself. Don't go with the flow. The 97%, you're right, the 3% are probably making a lot of money. One thing I leave you with is, I'm not selling modular, I'm not from that background, but a modular approach was key in managing cash flow, in my opinion. And that is what we tried back in those days, and it worked for a lot of investors. So just wanted to share that with you.
Yeah, no, and I'm a big believer in modular. I think digital obviously applies those principles. IOs applies those principles. But there's a lot of modular there's one type of modular that sits, I mean, you can put it out in a parking lot, and that's, I guess truly modular from that perspective. There's still a backplane cost in most of those scenarios. But in most cases for mission critical, it's going to go into a building. And it's in that going to a building that you ruin your first cost story, because you're spending $20 to $100 million, $200 million on the building. And so your first cost per kilowatt, when you add that to it, it can ruin your business model. So most of the modular misses that baseline assumption. Oh, I'm growing in 300 kilowatt increments. Isn't this fantastic? Well, you put in a backplane that costs a lot, and you have to put it in a building. All of a sudden, it's not as sexy. It's only when you endpoint it, and then you think on the surface, hey, if I grow in 300 kilowatt increments, won't that be better? I mean, because it sounds logical. It's just like my PUE, hey, if the compressors aren't running, it's going to be better, right? I mean, we all think that. It's just not intuitive, and you got to look at it holistically. So I agree, modular's definitely the approach, but include all the assumption sets in it.
Hi, Mike Brazzoni with Camp Marketing. Thank you for the economics presentation. I enjoyed your showing the marginal cost of adding additional pod of computers, the supply and demand, intersection of supply and demand, and the factor cost in your graphs. So enterprise IT and the business of compute are very different, and to have the advantage of fully loading a facility as it comes up results in a substantial opportunity to secure marginal revenue advantage that a traditional enterprise IT shop does not have, or a hosting facility if there's a lag in fully loading the facility. In the an example of a staged build out, are there any examples you know of where the applications that are running on that first pod are charged at 8x cost, the second pod at 7x cost, the sixth pod at 6x costs. And when you get down to that pod that costs $2,000, that's where your marginal revenue equals your marginal cost. So essentially, you can make more marginal revenue when you install that first pod of computers to essentially pay for the ones, to essentially take your marginal revenue for the ones that will follow. Are there any models that you've seen where people employ that strategy of an application's rollout in parallel with how they stage the installation of the computers in their data center to where it becomes fully loaded within the shell of the facility?
No, I mean, I think that to be able to charge 8 times for your first client and 7 times for your second client and 6 times from a service provider perspective, of course, that does not happen. From an enterprise perspective, I think you're looking at it on a more of a depreciation cost basis, and that's generally speaking taken as a charge on a straight line basis, no matter how you look at it. The issue is more on a cash flow and an NPV basis, in terms of what that return on that asset is where things lie. I think if you look at it, GAAP or IFRS is going to straight line a lot of those types of costs. I think the question is what's the cost of money? Michelle brought up earlier, debt's cheap. Yeah, it is cheap. It's not, is it sustainable forever? No. So all of a sudden, if you're looking at those cost dollars, there's a few different ways to look at it. But no, the key is figuring out what the chunk size is. So what's the minimum chunk size that can give you a complete solution, and then try to work off of that. If you have a viewpoint that you have enough load day one, then do scale all day long. Makes sense. My challenge to the audience is just, if you don't think you're there in a very short period of time, you've got to look at other options, because scale's going to create those issues.
I would hope that we can figure out how to not make it a commodity business from day one when it's the business of, I don't have an enterprise IT solution, but I would hope that there are ways to get out of this way of thinking that it has to be a commodity business from day one on the business of the side.
So the thought of a data center side being a commodity business, I would challenge that if you're not focused on commoditizing it from a cost perspective, you're going to get run over. But commoditization of cost element, in terms of looking at ways to continuously drive out cost, increase speed, doesn't necessarily neglect quality or features. It can in some cases, but as Dr. Deming taught us with the Japanese auto industry, it doesn't. The Camrys and Accords did come out. They did deliver on speed and low cost, but they also had a lot of quality and features in them. So there are ways to do it. There's plenty of business models out there that have shown us how to do it. I will say that there are very, very few companies that look at lean as a way of doing business in the data center space, and that's really where that next generation comes from.
Carl Brooks for 451 Research. I fully agree with everything you said in your presentation about scale in the data center, and from the perspective of the next wave of IT infrastructure providers, cloud providers, hosting providers, anyone who can roll out IT in a modular, incremental fashion, who can roll it out a rack at a time, who can remain profitable an aisle at a time, they love this. They love to see scale in a data center, and they are more than happy to take full advantage of the fact that you're not going to make any money for 10 years. Yep. They're going to make money hand over fist on this. It actually kind of enables their incremental commodity-like growth on the back of your actual data center commodity. So there is a real danger, or maybe an opportunity, to drive the floor space down to a commodity level just based on those provider customers, just leaving the enterprises out of the equation entirely. So my question is, how do you strike a balance if you run a data center between attracting those enterprises that are going to pay a premium and serving those infrastructure providers, those service providers where the actual demand is?
So, good point. I think that the viewpoint is on what you call a commodity. For example, I would say a phone is a commodity. I would say, you know, a mid-sized car could be viewed as a commodity, right? A passenger airplane could be viewed as a commodity at some level. The question is what are you productizing? You know, and how are you holding your margin on what it is that you're doing? There's two worlds out there. The first world for everything is industrialization. And in industrialization, right, the Henry Ford assembly line, buy tons of components, right, assemble them in different factors, and drive out costs by reducing component costs. The disruptive model from a lean perspective and productization perspective is to take all of those, take that model and throw it out and say, I'm only going to serve this segment. So if I'm a provider and I want to serve the soft layers of the world and the rack spaces of the world, and I design a product for them with features that are specific for them, and I focus on driving down my cost by having such a laser-like focus on what those guys need, because I know what they need, then I can still have a good business model and make money on that. I mean, you would think the plane business is a really crappy business. The Boeing 737 was made with the same partners each and every time, and it only does what it does. It was the most profitable plane of all time, the most sold plane of all time, and it never did a transatlantic flight. It disrupted the models by focusing on, and Southwest Airlines obviously took that and adapted that into a service model that revolutionized the fact that it was the only airline business that actually ever made money. So you take an industry like that, which the normal thought process was, why the hell would anybody want to be in the airline business? You can't make any money in that. And if you look at Southwest Airlines and you look at what Boeing did with a 737, it's pretty fascinating. So I think it's through specialization. I think it's through making those types of decisions. Now, of course, there's a danger with doing that. Steve Jobs is a genius for the iPhone and the iPod, but how many people remember him getting fired for the Newton? So product-based approaches are dangerous. You're picking what you can and what you can't do. But that's the way how you bypass that commoditization fear, in my opinion. Yes?
Chris Johnston with Cisco. You and I have butted heads before.
Never.
And I enjoyed it. But I wanted to say you're 100% right about PUE. This industry has worshipped at that altar too long. And I make this point. Our standard on every project is to look at say for a particular site, particular climate, particularly the particular utility costs, both electric and water, sewer, and things of this. Look at alternative cooling systems based on 3 different financial considerations. First cost, operating cost, which is PUE, and total cost of ownership. Then at the end of the day, you say, okay, Mr. Owner, pick one. Which one is most important to you? A lot of the colo people are more attuned towards first cost. A lot of the enterprise people are attuned to total cost of ownership. To my knowledge, we have had exactly one client say, no, I want to build it to get low PUE just because I want to prove a point. So I think you're exactly right. You're 100% on target.
Thank you. I would say one thing though, the this or this or this. I have a phrase with my team when you take a continuous improvement in a productization type of approach. Start with a pass-fail and then continuously improve over time. It's a different way of approaching things. So what I would say on your aspect of I have to choose this or this or this, I would suggest to everybody in here, get a B in all of them. Don't get an A. Don't try to get an A. Getting an A it has a law of diminishing returns apply. And I think that's it. So appreciate it. I guess we've got Julian coming up for owners versus designers. Should be fun. Maybe Chris and I can fight during the session, or we'll see. Thanks.